Thank you for joining me this week for our study of the Book of Mormon and Isaiah. This week's lesson is entitled The Coming of a King. And I do want to thank you. I think many of you know that I originally started off this endeavor just planning on doing it locally out of my house, which I am still teaching a local class. But then I felt inspired to put this up online. And while I certainly was never expecting a large following, and by YouTube standards, that is true, I'm still really pleasantly surprised by how many people come back every week to learn about this in-depth doctrine, this prophecy in depth, and analyzing it alongside the Book of Mormon. I really think that those numbers reflect an extraordinary level of commitment and people who desire to come into Christ, and the people that you will influence as you continue to learn. That impact will be much greater than we might even realize. So, truly, thank you. And this week, we're going to be studying Isaiah 11 and 12. This is picking up after going sort of chapter by chapter, intermixed with whatever Nephi and Jacob are throwing at us from the prophecy of Isaiah. So, when it comes to the coming of a king, I really labored over what to entitle this. Part of this is actually based on chapter 11 of 2nd Nephi, where Nephi is saying that he has seen his Redeemer, Jacob has seen his Redeemer, Isaiah has seen his Redeemer. And then he goes on to encourage us to rejoice. He's going to share the prophecy of Isaiah with the understanding that it will lead people ultimately to Christ, to know of the truthfulness of his coming. And he's speaking of multiple comings. He's speaking of the first coming, really, I guess you could say, when he's born. And then you could say even the first, second coming, where the resurrected Christ appears to his descendants. And he's speaking of the second coming that we all think of in the latter days, where the whole world is going to know that Christ comes. And he's speaking of the personal coming of Jesus Christ, that first, second coming that I would say that needs to happen for so many people before that really big second coming occurs that we all think of. And so let's just get into some of this prophecy, and hopefully these chapters will actually lead you to feel a little bit more warm and fuzzy than some of the ones that we've been covering before. So first of all, we're going to get into this idea of this branch of Jehovah, so to speak. In Isaiah 11:1, you'll see that the language here in the Isaiah Institute translation is quite a bit different from some of the other translations you may have read, including King James. And it says, "A shoot will spring up from the stalk of Jesse, and a branch from its graft bear fruit." The part that might be different for you there is this idea of a graft, because in the King James Version, it says, "There shall come forth a rod," which would be kind of like a branch of some kind, "out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." That's a little confusing there. So even, I would say, the Isaiah Institute one can be a little confusing. What it's talking about here, a stalk or a stem, is a stump. So this would be a tree stump, a tree that probably has been cut down. And that shoot that comes out, or a rod, is known as a choter. And this would be kind of a wild shoot. You often see those just kind of springing up out of the side of the tree, or right at the roots coming out of the ground, those things that you generally find undesirable. They're wild. They're not helpful in producing fruit. But if you have a tree that has died for some reason, maybe it's frozen or other damage has occurred, you can actually utilize that wild branch that grows up because it still has life in it. And then if you understand the prophecy in Jacob 5 about all of this grafting and taking branches from the original tree and grafting it into other parts of the vineyard and bringing it back in, this actually should make quite a bit of sense. Because what you have here would be like the Gentiles, something wild that isn't from the original tree, but that is taking on the life of this, I would say, tree of life of Jehovah. Really, he's ultimately the tree of life. And as they are providing that nourishment, you have one of these branches that was taken from the original tree before it died. And now it's an original Israelite branch that's being grafted back in to this shoot or hoter that's springing up out of Jesse. And this branch, interestingly enough, is bearing good fruit. Okay, that may or may not be clear to you, and it certainly didn't seem to be terribly clear to Joseph Smith. And so in Doctrine and Covenants 113, he just outright asks, what is the rod or branch, you could say, spoken of in the first verse of the 11th chapter of Isaiah that should come from the stem or stump of Jesse? And the answer he receives is, behold, thus saith the Lord, it is a servant in the hands of Christ, who is partly a descendant of Jesse, as well as of Ephraim, or the house of Joseph, on whom there is laid much power. So this is somebody who is descended basically from the tribe of Judah and also the tribe of Joseph, or perhaps in this case, specifically Ephraim. And then maybe because the language wasn't so clear, or because he understood something we don't, which is very likely given that it's a Joseph Smith, he asked, what is the root, meaning that grafted part, of Jesse spoken of in the 10th verse of the 11th chapter? And the answer is, behold, thus saith the Lord, it is a descendant of Jesse as well as of Joseph. So it sounds similar here, right? Well, he's from both Judah and Joseph, unto whom rightly belongs the priesthood and the keys of the kingdom, for an ensign and for the gathering of my people in the last days. Now, the question I would choose to ask here is, was he just saying it was the same person and Joseph Smith was just asking the same question twice, or are we talking about two different people? Well, as I haven't received any personal revelation on this matter, and for a good reason, I haven't really felt to dig too deeply into this idea of this end-time servant. I know a lot of people have, and I can see why people feel it's important to understand those things, but I personally have never felt that it's particularly important to me, to my family, or my mission to know this right now, or that when the time comes, it will be revealed to me. So that said, just know that there's somebody on whom is laid much power, and then there's somebody who has the keys of the kingdom for the gathering of Israel. So let's see what other people have said about this. Now, there is somebody who we understand to be an end time David, because there are just scriptures that come right out and say that. So, for instance, in Hosea, it says, afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God, and David, their king, shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Ezekiel 34:23 through 34 says, and I will set up one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them, even my servant David. He shall feed them, and he shall be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken it. Then in D&C 103:15, behold, I say unto you, the redemption of Zion must needs come by power. Therefore, I will raise up unto my people a man who shall lead them, like as Moses led the children of Israel. Now, if you'll remember last week, I read a quote by Bruce R. McConkie saying that the redemption of Zion would come only when we started living up to certain covenants like the people in the days of Enoch did. And until we understood that we needed essentially to seek Christ really quite literally and receive certain things, that the redemption of Zion wouldn't happen. So this is definitely talking about a future time here in D&C 103 when it's mentioning the redemption of Zion and this Moses-like figure. Okay, but in case you're thinking, well, sometimes the scriptures are really symbolic and it just means like a descendant of David, like Jesus or whoever, I want to take you to a couple of more, I guess I would say, modern revelations that make this pretty clear. So first of all, we'll go to the Encyclopedia of Mormonism. And in there, it speaks of David, prophetic figure of last days, and King David remains today one of the most renowned Old Testament figures, and his personality and all these things and the adultery, yada, yada. And then it says that the prophet Joseph Smith taught that the throne and kingdom of David is to be taken from him and given to another by the name of David in the last days, raised up out of his lineage. So somebody by the name of David who is from his lineage. And then Elder Horson Hyde said in his dedicatory prayer on the Mount of Olives, October 24th, 1841, prophesied that the Jews would return to Jerusalem and that in time a leader called David, even a descendant from the loins of ancient David, would be their king. And then it goes on to quote what I believe I just did, in Hosea 3:5, and as well as other prophecies like Jeremiah 30:9 and in Ezekiel. And then it actually goes on to say, speaking to Joseph Smith, the angel Moroni cited the Old Testament passages telling of significant figures who would be involved with Christ's millennial reign. As prophesied in Isaiah, it appears that two persons are spoken of, a rod and a root, one a leader on whom there is laid much power, the other a person with special priesthood keys. These leaders are believed by some to be among the, quote, messianic figures spoken of in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in rabbinic literature. And of course, there are a lot of people with these messianic roles or qualities, but that Jesus Christ ultimately exemplifies all of these, that he is the ultimate prophet, priest, and king, and so forth. And that some people do see in Christ the complete fulfillment of this prophecy, and others feel that certain titles and functions of the king that do apply to Jesus will also apply to another righteous king by the name of David. Okay, so then we're going to go to Joseph Smith papers. It has a really similar quote here, but it's just kind of toward the end. I think it's interesting to read this whole thing to give it context, because sometimes people, I feel, have kind of a little disingenuously quoted this or parts of it and left out other parts. So here's that quote again for you from the Times and Seasons. And speaking of David in this last paragraph here, going really to hell and how we don't fully understand what's going to happen there for him. He says, although David was a king, he never did obtain the spirit and power of Elijah and the fullness of the priesthood. Now, remember, we spoke about that again last week. We had a really interesting quote from Brigham Young on how he wasn't sure he knew of anybody in his day who had the fullness of the priesthood. And the priesthood that he received and the throne and kingdom of David is to be taken from him and given to another by the name of David in the last days, raised up out of his lineage. And then he speaks about how Peter refers to this. And really, he's referencing Peter because he's talking about the idea of sinning against the Holy Ghost or committing an unpardonable sin. Okay, so in the Times and Seasons, February 15th, 1842, it's speaking about this millennial day that we're going to be getting into here in Isaiah, how Joseph and Judah come together, and it's quoting Ezekiel. Again, David will be their servant and their king, and Israel's going to dwell in their lands of inheritance, or Jacob as it's called, probably speaking though of Israel and the lost tribes as well, and this covenant of peace that's going to take place. And in speaking of this, it says that this quote is speaking of the righteous in the millennium, right? That Satan will be cast out and that the Lord will set his sanctuary in the midst of these people. And it says the fact that they will multiply and increase shows that they will be in a state of mortality, these people that it's speaking of in Ezekiel. And it says, the immortal saints will be made kings and priests, and they shall reign with Christ. But it is not said that the mortal ones shall be made kings and priests to hold authority with Christ like the immortal ones, while in a state of mortality. Only they shall have a king, priests, and all other necessary officers to administer all ordinances and perform all necessary ceremonies. We mean a king that shall be chosen or proceed out of their midst. Isaiah, speaking of this day, says, "The Lord will restore their judges as at first and their counselors as at the beginning. This will be the time that God will restore their kingdom unto them," which the apostles alluded to when they inquired of Jesus if he would restore the kingdom of Israel. According to the prophets, the name of this king shall be David, not the patriarch David, who was the son of Jesse, but a literal descendant of his. Some suppose that the psalmist David will be raised from his tomb and again reign over Israel. But we consider this one of the most unreasonable ideas that could be advanced. He no doubt will be, in the Lord's own due time, raised from the dead, but not to act the part of a prince in the midst of Israel, who remain in the flesh. Neither will any of the patriarchs act the part of an earthly king, although they will reign with Christ. Indeed, we have no reason to believe that Christ himself will act the part of an earthly king or priest to any great extent. It is inconsistent for us to suppose that the immortal saints who are glorified will be perpetually confined in the midst of the mortal ones. Because it is said they shall reign on the earth is no reason why we should say they shall be constantly among the mortal saints. The idea is that the earth will be under the control of Christ and the glorified saints, and Christ will virtually reign over the whole earth, and this David will be subject to him. The redeemed saints will reign on earth and perhaps have in many respects authority over the mortal ones. We do not wish to be understood that there will be a total or entire separation between the mortal and immortal, but the object of the foregoing remarks is to show the distinction of privilege. The prophet says that the Lord shall reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and before his ancients gloriously. Hence, when the redeemed saints dwell on earth, they will dwell in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, which places the Lord will fully prepare for them. We might dilate upon this part of the subject, that is the reign and dominion of the redeemed saints, till we fill a volume, but brevity admonishes us to hasten. So those who are anxious to learn more concerning this reign of the saints can search the scriptures for themselves. Okay, so that is what has been said about that. There's quite a bit of debate over this as to, well, it's actually Joseph Smith or whatever. I have no interest in getting caught up in that topic. I'm just going to continue with what's already been written, as I said, since I don't have anything particularly to add to this, other than this idea that there are probably two people spoken of. I mentioned in a previous lesson that in Second Nephi, it speaks of the one who is mighty in word and deed, who is an instrument in the hands of God and will work mighty wonders. And it has something to do with this restoration. And in older copies of the Book of Mormon, in the footnotes to that, it literally just says in the bottom, an Indian prophet, which I find really interesting because we know that in these verses, towards the end of that chapter, that Lehi tells his son Joseph that this person is going to be his descendant. And I would just like to point out that later on in, I believe, Second Nephi 10, really study that because it is really specific prophecy relating to the descendants of Nephi, or Joseph and Jacob and Nephi, and their descendants on this land, and the Gentiles coming to this land, and the prophecies that will be fulfilled here. So be careful in interpreting things in other ways that don't apply, because really it's specific to the promised land here. And then in 1947, Spencer W. Kimball, in speaking of this prophecy in 2 Nephi 3:24, see, I can't read Roman numerals apparently. He's speaking about how we have an obligation really to the seed of Lehi, or the Lamanites, who will become, as he says, white and delightsome, and how they will become Zion, essentially. And then towards the end of this quote, he says, "And in the day when their prophet shall come, one shall rise." And then he quotes 2 Nephi 3:24, "Mighty among them, being an instrument in the hands of God with exceeding faith to work mighty wonders." And then he goes on to say, "Brothers and sisters, the fluorescence of the Lamanites is in our hands." So that's something interesting to consider as well. Now, whoever these prophecies are speaking of, whoever they are in our day, I think that it's important just generally to understand what a Davidic servant is. And we'll probably get more into this later as we get into more Book of Mormon stories that exemplify this. But one example of this is found in 2 Chronicles 30:18 through 20. Speaking of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah really, I know Abraham really holds him up as this example of what it means to be a Davidic servant for many reasons. And it says that since many of the people had not purified themselves at a time where Hezekiah is trying to reestablish temple rituals, cleanse the temple, rebuild the temple, that a lot of people weren't ready still, spiritually speaking. And it says because of this, the Levites had to slaughter their Passover lamb for them to set them apart for the Lord. And most of these who came from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, so these lost tribes, right, had not purified themselves. But King Hezekiah prayed for them, and they were allowed to eat the Passover meal. And think about what Passover means. Why did we even have a Passover lamb? Right? Because it was during a time where there are all these plagues coming on to Egypt, and the firstborn sons were going to be slain, and they needed protection from death. But these people weren't ready to make that kind of a covenant or perform those rituals, but Hezekiah could intercede on their behalf. And because of that, they were allowed to partake of this Passover. And even though this was contrary to the requirements of the law, for Hezekiah said, "May the Lord, who is good, pardon those who decide to follow the Lord, the God of their ancestors, even though they are not properly cleansed for the ceremony." And the Lord listened to Hezekiah's prayer and healed the people. That's so interesting, right? He healed the people. This is what it means to be a Davidic servant in the latter days. It's understanding that maybe not everybody around you can live up to a higher law. But if you covenant to live a higher law, and you have made the sacrifices, and Hezekiah certainly did experience some pretty hard things in this role, you can also intercede on behalf of other people who aren't ready. And that is really, in the sense of a Davidic covenant, what it means to be a father or a mother. But of course, really, this goes into the Abrahamic covenants that we make in the temple and becoming a father forever, because that's what it says about this end time king. It says he will be wonderful counselor, a father forever. So a lot of this stuff, I think, bleeds over into itself for me in a lot of ways. We talk a lot about eternal posterity, and we think of that as very literal in the sense of Abraham, perhaps. But in the sense of a Davidic covenant, it can sort of be like your adopted family in many ways, as you have a care or given a charge by the Lord for certain groups of people. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so moving on now to that was all Isaiah 11 chapter 1 there. So let's move on to verse 2, shall we? Okay, so speaking of this shoot and branch, it says the spirit of Jehovah will rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the spirit of counsel and of valor, the spirit of knowledge and of fear of Jehovah. His intuition will be guided by the fear of Jehovah. He will not judge by what his eyes see, nor establish proof by what his ears hear. He will judge the poor with righteousness and with equity, arbitrate for the lowly in the land. He will smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips slay the wicked. The righteous will be as a band about his waist, faithfulness a girdle around his loins. Okay, we're going to really dig into this one. There's a lot to go into here. First of all, isn't it interesting how we broke down Jacob's Sermon on the Mount last week? And hopefully you kind of had eyes to see how a lot of that language had to do with the temple and the initiatory. And what do we have here in Isaiah 2 through 5? We talk about the mind or the understanding, the knowledge that starts, we might say, with the head. And the idea of intuition actually has to do with smell. It literally is smell, but it can be interpreted different ways. So now we're going to the nose. And of course, smell has to do with the idea in the temple of this sweet savor from the sacrifices of those who offer up righteous sacrifices to the Lord, right? So he's going to judge by that, not necessarily by the position somebody holds or how educated they are. It's going to be by their true offerings that they're offering up and how much it's been sanctified by the Spirit. And then you go to his eyes and his ears and his mouth, and then to his waist and this girdle, which I find really interesting. But first, we need to go into some other verses here and then bring it all in together, tie it all in. So let's go now to Isaiah 6 through 8 of chapter 11. And it says, "Then shall the wolf dwell among the lambs, and the leopard lie down with the young goats, calves and young lions will feed together, and a youngster will lead them to pasture. When a cow and a bear browse, their young will rest together. The lion will eat straw, like the ox. A suckling infant will play near the adder's den, and the toddler reach his hand over the viper's nest." Well, what on earth could all of that mean? Well, first of all, if you'll notice here, all of these pairings are kosher and unkosher animals, and that's done very much on purpose. For instance, wolves, lambs, leopards, goats, lions, and calves, or baby cows, and then cows and bears. And then, interestingly, a human and a viper. We're going to dig into that as well. But understand also that lambs, goats, and calves or cows were also animals that were offered up in the temple or the tabernacle for sacrifices. So these are sacrificial, holy offerings. Now, what were these offerings about? Well, there's a lot of similarities with modern day temple rituals and offerings. So for instance, originally you could offer up a lamb as part of a burnt offering or the sin offering. And with this offering, there was nothing left. You burned the whole thing. It was all sacrificed. Kind of think of it as the idea of sacrificing the natural man. And you could think of this just in terms of Adam after the Garden of Eden, simply just doing something out of obedience because he promised in Eden to be completely obedient to the voice of God. And we'll go actually into this more. I'll have a whole diagram and all of that for you in a future lesson. So I'm just going to quickly go through the rest of this. The next offering is a grain offering. This is called a free will offering or a thanks offering that also goes along with the drink. You could see this almost as like baptism and then taking the sacrament, and still kind of like on a lesser level, but these offerings that are acceptable to God. And then you have a peace offering or another free will offering that has to do with this idea of fellowship, which I find really interesting. And this is one of those offerings that goes along also with the fat being trimmed from the organs, like, around your heart, right? And there's a feast that generally takes place, because people are eating now some of this offering, where some of it's offered and some of it is consumed. And then you go on to the sin offering. Again, the fat is trimmed, but in this sin offering, which I think you're going up from, I would say, kind of a celestial level of offerings to more of a terrestrial, you have both male and female goats that are offered with that one. The leaders have a male goat, so the one who I would say is the high priest that represents Christ, and then the congregation has the female. So you have the male and female coming together here. And doesn't that sound like a covenant of chastity that we make in the temple at a terrestrial level? And I know from my own personal experience with revelation and study that the millennial day and a terrestrial state has a whole heck of a lot to do with the female and the elevating of the feminine. And then finally, the trespass offering is an offering of restitution. You could even say restoration. And look now, if we're going with all 5 of these offerings here in Isaiah 11, what is being offered here up as the sacrifice? It's the infant, the toddler, you could say the newborn son or daughter of Zion. We are the ultimate offering here. Like Christ himself was the sort of human offering, right? And yet the trespass offering is for something that is an unintentional sin. And to offer this, you offer up money, or you could say tokens. I find this really interesting because I see this as going hand in hand with the role of a Davidic servant. There are many ways in which those people who understand that covenant and look into it know that not only can they offer themselves up as a vessel or an offering on behalf of those who cannot take care of these things on their own, they can do so for those who have passed on, who are beyond the veil. That's what we do in the temple, really, if you think about it. We are there as a vessel physically for those who are on the other side of the veil who cannot do this for themselves. And in doing so, generational traumas can be healed. Things that are handed down that we manifest in our families and we don't even know why. Like, why does this run in our family? Or there seems to be a curse, or, oh, it's genetic, we'll say a lot of times. And really, genes don't work that way. But we say, oh, it's genetic because it does run in the family. And those who step up and understand their role as Davidic servants know that they can work with Christ and his grace, and ultimately it's his healing power to be the vessel for that light and that healing power to work through them on behalf of loved ones in mortality and also on the other side of the veil. Okay, now I want to dig in some more here to verse 8. This idea of the suckling infant playing near the adder's den and the toddler who reaches his hand over the viper's nest. So you can play around with this language a little bit. So first of all, the hand here is a hand that covers a hole that hole there is actually a specific kind of hole that refers to a hole that's made for light. So it's different from the word of a hole for a den. It's a hole that's an opening for light. And where else have we heard of a hole that was made for light? In the story of the brother of Jared. Remember that he made 8 vessels here. There's so much to go into here with the brother of Jared. We just don't even have time. But what I will say is the shape of the vessels is really specific. And it has to do with this idea of not just traveling through water, but traveling, I would say, across the great deep to another realm, another dimension, another world. There's just a lot of ways you could put it. And that hole for light, that's specific too. But remember that didn't always work and they needed stones. And interestingly, Elder Bednar, in an address in the MTC, actually for Christmas, at Christmas time, specifically said that the stones represent people. Now, these stones were filled with light, and they needed 2 per vessel. So you had 8 vessels, and then 16 stones, or 8 stones on one side, 8 on the other. That would be 888. And interestingly, then it goes on to say how, like the friends of the brother of Jared and his brother were 22. And I really think it's probably just talking about the men there because it mentions children and things separately. So it sounds like it's saying that there's Mahanrai, Moriakimer, Jared, their friends, and that's 24. So that's 3 8s again. 888, 888. What is 888? That is the Greek gematria for Christ. Literally, I saw this. It was so interesting. I did a temple walk through the other day of the Saratoga Springs Temple, and I saw 888 everywhere. And it just really made me wonder if that was intentional or not, if it was just something that was artistic and they didn't realize they were being inspired to. I don't know, but that was really interesting. But it means Christ. And of course, what is Nephi ultimately inviting everybody to do is to make that journey to Christ, which is impossible really without this divine intervention. And of course, it says they go into the depths of the sea and that there are these sea monsters, not just whales. It mentions whales and sea monsters. Well, what's that all about? Okay, now stick with me here. We're going to go to Psalm 74, and it's going to talk about a kind of a sea monster. And it says that in speaking, I believe, of a prophecy again about the end times and what's known in Daniel, the abomination of desolation, it says, they have cast fire into thy sanctuary. They have defiled by casting down the dwelling place of thy name to the ground. They said in their hearts, let us destroy them together. They have burned up all the synagogues of God in the land. We see not our signs. There is no more any prophet, neither is there any among us, any that knoweth how long. O God, how long shall the adversary reproach? Shall the enemy blaspheme thy name forever? Why withdrawest thou thy hand, even thy right hand? And if you know Isaiah, you know that that's significant. And I really believe that Isaiah took a lot of his imagery and language from Psalms, because there's just so much there. But thy right hand, pluck it out of thy bosom. So a right hand who's in somebody's bosom, like Christ was in the bosom of the Father, or other beloved people were in the bosom of Christ. Going on, for God is my king of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. This is going to come up later in this prophecy of Isaiah here. So keep that in mind. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Meat to the people, the Leviathan? What? Thou didst cleave the fountain and the flood. Thou driedst up mighty rivers. Now, if you've done your reading for this week, you'll know that this is significant. But in the Enuma Elish, which was around the time of Isaiah, and remember, I've mentioned that in order to understand Isaiah, you need to understand that he incorporates mythology and things like that from his area. And in the Enuma Elish, Marduk, who essentially represents like the sun, battles against Tiamat, who is this force of waters and the great deep, and she represents chaos. And what's interesting, because this is going to come up later, is he uses wind essentially to defeat this goddess of the primordial waters. And then he uses a spear or whatever, and he cuts her in half. And half of the sea monster carcass is used to make a covering, a heaven in the sky, so to speak. So I'm relating all of this to this idea of the viper, the serpent, because it was always understood to be part of this mythology or this idea of chaos and waters and the adversary. And then this idea of the girdle is also related to this idea of Leviathan or a serpent. Remember that we read earlier that this person who comes from Jesse, or you could say Joseph and Jesse, has this girdle and this band about his waist. Now, in the Talmudic tractate in 74a, it says that the Holy One, blessed be he, will in time come to make a tabernacle for the righteous from the skin of the Leviathan. This is crazy that it's saying almost the exact same thing that the Enuma Elish said about the skin of the Leviathan being a tabernacle, or you could say a temple. And then in Josephus, he talks about how the priests had a girdle that wrapped around their chest or their midsection, and that looked like snakeskin, and that it was referencing this idea. And then there's even a midrash that talks about how that sash around the chest is golden and represents the waters as well as this serpent or sea serpent. And this serpent shone like gold, even in the great deep, because it said that it had the remnants of a glory like the sun, because it was understood that it had fallen from a celestial glory. Okay, so what the heck am I getting at here? Well, in Revelation 1 and 13, John sees a vision of Jesus Christ, and it says, in the midst of this, he's in the midst of the 7 candlesticks. Now, what are the 7 candlesticks? That's the menorah, that's the tree of life. And ultimately, that is meant to be in the Holy of Holies. I know we show it as being in sort of only the holy place, but really every vision of Christ, which is in the Holy of Holies, has this tree of life. So it's there. And then it says that he was like unto the Son of Man. He's clothed with a garment down to the foot and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. So if you want to understand what this suckling infant and toddler is doing with this adder's den, there are probably multiple ways of looking at this, but this idea is that the serpent is overcome, chaos is defeated. It's a skin that is given similar to like the coat of skins given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, because Christ has overcome. But it's not just about like killing or defeating, because it's that very skin that's used to make the tabernacle. And really, the high priest's robes represent the temple. We are the temple. It goes so much deeper than that. It goes to the idea of embracing the adversarial side that is in all of us. It's about being willing to go into the depths, into the unknown, into the chaotic waters, and embrace everything, the light and the dark, as part of this process of rebirth. It's like my kids with their OCD therapy. The thing that they feared the most was the thing that they needed to actually face and look head on and do what was actually called riding the wave, interestingly enough. Feel all the feels, all the fear, all the whatever it is, until Christ can come in and ride that wave with you, and it subsides and you heal. And that is part of this process of being a Davidic servant, is being willing to experience things on behalf of others. And I mean quite literally, and it can be quite brutal, but that is what it means. And so those who do that, who embrace that darkness, who offer that up as a sacrifice, offer themselves up, both, I would say, the light and the dark, that Christ brings all that together in one ultimately, and our weakness becomes our strength. And that is what I believe this symbolizes on one level. So whether or not that made sense to you, we are moving on now, because one other thing I want to point out is that all of these non-kosher animals that Isaiah mentions, the bear, the leopard, the lion, are also all the animals that are mentioned in Daniel 7 in his vision. The same guy who had the vision of the abomination of desolation. And he sees a beast that looks like all these animals. And interestingly, though, in this same prophecy, it says that 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the anointed one. Now, anointed, of course, one way of saying that is Messiah. And so in speaking of these prophecies, some people will say Messiah ben David or Messiah ben Joseph. So an anointed one could mean many different people. So this anointed one comes, and then Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times. After this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing, which is interesting because there's some similar language like that in Isaiah. We mentioned this, like when Nephi's brothers laugh at him and, oh, this is all in vain kind of a thing. And a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with a flood and war, and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. The ruler will make a treaty with the people for a period of one set of 7, but after half this time, he will put an end to the sacrifices and offerings. So this is the abomination of desolation. And as a climax to all his terrible deeds, he will set up a sacrilegious object, etc., etc. So I just think it's interesting that in this same prophecy about some kind of anointed one and these non-kosher beasts, that there's this abomination of desolation. But the beautiful thing is in the prophecy of Isaiah is that these all come together. And by the way, this is also really similar to the beast in Revelation 13, 1 through 2. A beast rising up out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns, and it looks like a leopard, and it has the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. Interestingly, these people who have these kinds of visions have really similar imagery in their visions. Okay, so moving on now to Isaiah 9 through 10, it says that there shall be no harm or injury done throughout my holy mountain. What is a holy mountain? It's a temple, right? Of course, is it a temple in the way that we have them now, or is it something grander? I don't know. But in speaking of the millennial day, because this is a millennial day prophecy, it says that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of Jehovah as the oceans are overspread with waters. So knowledge and Jehovah, to Yada, to really know him personally, and that the whole earth is going to be filled with this. And in that day, the sprig of Jesse, who stands for an ensign to the peoples, shall be sought by the nations, and his rest shall be glorious. What is his rest? Why is his rest so glorious? Well, let's just do a quick little word study of the word rest. Doctrine and Covenants 101, 30 through 31. In that day, an infant shall not die. Infant. Isn't it interesting that it's speaking about all these young things? Like, for instance, we mentioned in that more terrestrial level of covenant making, you have a mother cow and a mother bear with their young, but all these are like very young babes, toddlers, right? And here it's an infant will not die. So in one sense, you could say, besides this idea of being reborn, they're not decaying. There's not like a decay that's going on. When you're younger, your cells are multiplying and dividing, and you're just growing. You're not subject to the laws of gravity so much as those of us who are near 46 are. Things are different, and they won't die until they're old, it says. And his life shall be as the age of a tree. Oh, there's that tree imagery again. And when he dies, he shall not sleep, that is to say, in the earth, but shall be changed in the twinkling of an eye, and shall be caught up, and his rest shall be glorious. So this is that idea of, being caught up. There's multiple times, I think, where people are caught up, but this could either be referencing the idea of translation and then just like a sudden resurrection that happens. There's no death involved in that process now because there's no death and decay. And then in Doctrine and Covenants 121:32, it says, according to that which was ordained in the midst of the counsel of the eternal God of all other gods before this world was, that should be reserved unto the finishing and the end thereof, when every man shall enter into his eternal presence and into his more immortal rest. So this is the idea of that rest that has to do with being literally in God's presence. That's what rest is. And there are so many scriptures too that have to do with God resting in us. But this also ties back to the idea of waters and the great deep. Now, in Isaiah 11:15 through 16, it says, Jehovah will dry up the tongue of the Egyptian sea by his mighty wind. Okay, so here's this idea of wind being used to overcome these waters of chaos. He will extend his hand over the river and smite it into 7 streams, similar to that psalm that we read, to provide a way on foot, and there shall be a pathway out of Assyria for the remnant of his people who shall be left, as there was for Israel when it came up from the land of Egypt. Now, came up is interesting because that actually could be translated as ascend. So those who are ascending out of Egypt, so to speak. Then let's compare some of this language now to a creation story, because if this is temple imagery, then obviously there's going to be a creation story involved here, right? In Genesis 1:2, it says that the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. The deep waters, like what the brother of Jared went into. And the Spirit of God, or Ruach, which Ruach can also be translated as breath or wind. So the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Now, hovering is interesting because that can also be interpreted as brooding. And who does brooding? Well, that would be a mother, like a mother hen brooding over her eggs. So this again has to do with this idea of rebirth from chaos. Also, think about it in the sense that in the beginning, everything was one, nothing had been separated out. And in the end, everything's going to come back together, but with more. It's going to be multiplied, right? That was the command, to multiply. It's going to be glorified because that light will be multiplied. And then when everything comes back together, it will be even more wonderful than before. And so part of the idea of this journey, this temple journey, this covenant journey, is understanding that everything that you see as separate from you, like I would never do that, I would never be that, I would, whatever it is, it's still a part of you. And either you glorify God by bringing it to the light and allow this sanctifying healing process to happen, or you keep pushing it away and you're still separate and you are not one. I know I'm getting like really kind of esoteric or meta or whatever, and I hope y'all are following me here. It's hard sometimes to put these things into words. But moving on, in Genesis 2, then in this creation story, 9 through 10, it talks about how in the middle of the Garden of Eden, God placed a tree of life. Where's the tree of life? In the Holy of Holies. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river flowed from the land of Eden, watering the garden and then dividing into 4 branches. Now, this river that divides into 4, much like the river that God smites into 7 streams, it covers the whole earth. That's the idea. 4 is like going to all 4 corners of the earth. And so you can see how there's really similar creation imagery here in the end times, in this millennial day, in a terrestrial Garden of Eden prophecy in Isaiah. And ultimately, anything in the Garden of Eden is going to be temple. Not just because of our temple ceremonies, but because you have the dust and the earth and like this lower level that they go from. And then you move up to Eden, and then you move up from Eden to where the tree of life is in the highest level. So it's these 3 levels of ascension. Now, I should backtrack because we actually skipped over some verses and speaking of this idea of rest. But as you talk about God reclaiming his people out of really the 4 corners of the earth, from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, all the isles of the sea, he's going to raise an ensign to the nations and assemble the exiled of Israel and gather the scattered of Judah from the 4 directions of the earth. And then in verse 13, it says, Ephraim's jealousy shall pass away, and the hostile ones of Judah be cut off. Ephraim will not envy Judah, nor Judah resent Ephraim, but they will swoop on the Philistine flank toward the west, and together plunder those in the east. So it's this idea of the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph coming together. And what were we talking about here at the beginning? We're talking about a tree or branches of a tree. These are sticks. These are sticks coming together, literally by these tribes coming together, also literally in a person or those people who are these literal descendants. And then we're talking, if you'll notice, some of you who are astute may have noticed that I kind of skipped over something in Isaiah 6 and 7, because there weren't just 5 times where these animals were mentioned. There was also like a 6th one, but it's a repeat of the same animals. And it's saying that the lion will eat straw like the ox.
So it mentions the lion and the ox or the cows together again. But think about what this is saying, because lions represent Judah in the Old Testament, and the ox actually represents Ephraim. So this is Judah or Joseph, rather, I should say, coming together. And what are they eating up? Straw. What is straw? Straw is chaff. It's not the grain, it's the chaff that is often spoken of in prophecies about being scattered or burnt or things like that. Well, now you've got the lion and the ox coming together, eating up this chaff. And that's kind of what it's saying here as well in Isaiah. So this is all coming together here with the stick of Joseph and stick of Judah. And I know that we often talk about the stick of Joseph and Judah as being the Book of Mormon and the Bible, and that is one way of looking at it. But again, we really have to be careful when we read some of these prophecies to say, this is it. Like, this is the total summation of the fulfillment of this prophecy, because then we miss out on other wonderful, glorious things that we can be given to understand. And so there are multiple levels to the idea of the stick of Joseph and Judah as our understanding grows, as we seek, ask, and knock. Okay, and then finally, I would just want to point out that in Doctrine and Covenants 133, 26 through 27, that prophecy is so similar to this idea of these streams being dried up and divided and all of that. It says, and they who are in the north country shall come in remembrance before the Lord, and their prophets shall hear his voice. Now, who are the people in the north countries? Well, those would be those lost tribes that are spoken of. Their prophets shall hear his voice and shall no longer stay themselves, and they shall smite the rocks, and ice shall flow down at their presence, and an highway shall be cast up in the midst of the great deep. Isn't that interesting? A highway in the midst of the great deep. This would draw our minds back to Moses parting the Red Sea. So that idea of splitting the streams, things like that. But remember, great deep can mean something way more vast than just water. And so there could be a lot going on here with this. I don't want to get too into that, but I would say that's something to really pray about and consider. So we're going to just kind of summarize and end here with this idea of the serpent. And remember that the serpent can be both positive or negative. When Moses was with the children of Israel in the wilderness, it says that there were these fiery flying serpents, and that Moses was told to put a fiery serpent on a pole. Now, what I find really interesting about this language is the word for serpent is saraf, and the word for angel is seraph. And remember, they don't have vowels in their words, so it literally could say fiery flying seraphs or angels. And of course, that goes into some other things, because it could look like something fiery and flying in the air that looks like electricity, but that's probably for another day and another theory. But he puts something brass, essentially, right, up on this pole, and he says, focus on this. Focus on this fiery flying serpent, because these other ones are hurting the people, and they're dying because of that. And what are these people choosing to do? How many of them choose to look up and focus on that aspect of the fiery flying serpent and not on the pain that they're experiencing? Are you listening with your spiritual ears here? Let me share with you one more scripture real quick. It's actually in that scripture that we were reading about Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 30. When he reinstitutes this temple, he rebuilds the temple in Jerusalem and reinstitutes the sacrifices. It also says that he adds something else here. If you'll look in verse 21, that there were 7 days of great rejoicing, and that they praised the Lord every day with resounding instruments dedicated to the Lord. So they've gone through this temple path, you could say, of ascension. You can almost say you're in the Holy of Holies now in this part of the process.
And now they're praising God with music and instruments. And Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levites who showed good understanding of the service of the Lord. And they ate this feast because there's two times where you eat these offerings. Remember that when Jesus came to see the Nephites after he was resurrected, how many sacraments were there? Go look that up. And they offered the fellowship offerings, right? What's so interesting to me about that idea of fellowship is it totally relates to the idea of the gospel law that we agree to enter into, really, which is a law of love and loving your neighbors that we agree to as part of baptism, mourning with those who mourn, comforting those who stand in need of comfort. That as we grow in our understanding of what it means to truly follow the law of the gospel of Jesus Christ, it becomes more and more about this idea of Davidic service on behalf of others, loving them, experiencing what they're experiencing. But I digress. Let's keep going on. So, as part of this temple restitution here, it says that the whole assembly celebrated for another 7 days. So, another pattern of seven there, and another 7 days they celebrated joyfully. And that they celebrated with everyone, including foreigners. There was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the days of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites stood to bless the people, and God heard them, for their prayer reached heaven, his holy dwelling place. So, what am I talking about here? I am talking, brothers and sisters, about praise. And what is Isaiah 12 all about? It's about praise. It says, in that day you will say, I praise you, O Jehovah. Although you have been angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you have consoled me. Only people who repent really, I think, truly understand this kind of praise. In the God of my salvation, I will trust without fear, for Jehovah was my strength and my song when he became my salvation. Then shall you rejoice in drawing water from the fountains of salvation. In that day you will say, give thanks to Jehovah, invoke his name. Make known his deeds among the nations, commemorate his exalted name. Sing in praise of Jehovah who has performed wonders. Let it be acknowledged throughout the earth. Shout and sing for joy, O inhabitants of Zion, for renowned among you is the Holy One of Israel. Brothers and sisters, there are glorious days ahead, and there will be some darkness and pain, but where we keep our focus is what's ultimately going to determine how we experience the days ahead. Will it be in fear or will it be in praise? Where are you going to focus your thoughts, your eyes, your ears, your words, that come out of your mouth, your sense of smell, whatever it is, touch, whatever that is? Where are you going to focus things when these painful things come up? Are you going to avoid them and run away from them, or are you going to go towards them and embrace them so that we can glorify God ultimately in the end? Because I can tell you that if every time that fear wells up, the pain comes up, the darkness manifests as it does because of whatever's happened in your life or in generations past, that if you can just acknowledge it, give it a name, whatever it is, present it to the Lord, offer that part of yourself on the altar. Here it is. Now do with it what you will, and flip that to gratitude, because you have faith, you believe and know that he has already taken care of it, that he has all power to heal everything in every way. Praise him, give that thanks, feel that joy and that love, and be willing to love even those parts of yourselves or others, and thank him for the opportunity to do this work. I promise if you do that, you will experience miracles in your life. You will begin to have the eyes to see the miracles that are happening constantly every day all around us, as Christ is just trying his best to get us to wake up and see what is possible. And what is possible is the coming of Christ. And whether that looks like a king in Jerusalem named David, or kings and queens of the Gentiles here, or however that looks, it's going to be glorious. And to just do what Nephi encouraged us to do, which is to
lift up our hearts and rejoice for all men, because God's got it all figured out. They have a plan. It's going to all work out in the end. And I know that as we come unto Christ, that's how
we'll
we'll
receive everything we need, that we've been prepared to do this. We came here for such a time as this. We'll be prepared for whatever is ahead as long as we keep our gaze focused on the love and gratitude for and praise of our King, Jesus Christ. Amen.